Welcome to the Essential 99 Punctuation Rules for Court Reporters, video number 5, Punctuation Overview. I'm Ken Wick. Let's get started. This video will cover ebook sections G12 through G20, which is a punctuation overview of the period, the question mark, the comma, the semicolon, the colon, the hyphen, the dash, quotation mark, and parentheses. And this is just a general overview, and you could be asking yourself, well, when do you generally use these punctuation marks? It's nice to learn the rules of when to use them, but the question could be asked is, gee, when do you generally use a semicolon? If someone were to ask you that question, do you start repeating rules? Well, this video is actually going to cover that. Like, what's the general concept or idea behind these punctuation marks? So, to me, this is very important. If you learn this or know this as you look at the different rules, the rules make a lot of sense or just fit these general concepts. So let's cover the period and the question mark. The period, the question mark and an exclamation mark are actually called terminal marks. The exclamation mark is currently not used in court reporting. I actually have a grammar book, a court reporting grammar book from the 1980s, and it had the exclamation, but it was used basically rarely. And now you can't find its use in the court reporting references. The period. The period basically ends a sentence of a statement or a command. It is basically a thought separator, and a sentence can be classified into 4 basic patterns: a simple sentence, a compound sentence, a complex sentence, and a compound complex sentence. And I'm going to cover those in the next video. So basically, a period ends a statement or command and is a thought separator. Question mark basically ends a sentence that's asking a question. The comma. This is where we start digging in. The comma is actually just a general separator. It's also considered a neutral separator when compared to the dash or parenthesis. So a dash is actually a more emphasized separator, and the parentheses is a less emphasis separator. But the comma is just a general and neutral separator. That's probably why it's the most common. A comma separates equal sentence elements, such as independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction. If you don't know what this is one of the rules. It also separates items in a series, and it separates what are called coordinate adjectives. And I will cover this. This is actually one of the rules. So if you're unsure about any one of these, I will cover these in a rule. But basically, the idea is that the comma separates equal sentence elements. So independent, items separating equal items or equal adjectives. It also separates unequal sentence elements, like an introductory element from a main clause, or separates a non-essential element from the rest of the sentence. It also separates the sentence from a quote, and it separates, it's used in dates and addresses and other things. And these are all unequal, because in an address, the street address is different than the state, or is different from the city. They are not equal. Just like the day and the month and year are not equal in a date. So, and then just a passing comment, which we will cover later. But if you actually have, the question could arise of, well, what happens when one of these elements already has commas, and where they most commonly appear in the equal and unequal sentence elements is if the items of a series, you can imagine items of a series is just like I went to the store and bought bread, milk, and eggs. The bread, milk, and eggs are just series in items in a series, and The other type is a non-essential element. If either one of these already has commas, then you use a semicolon or a dash. In the cases for items in a series we'll discover, you use a semicolon, and if a non-essential element already has commas, then you use a dash. So let's move on to the semicolon and colon. Now the semicolon, it only separates equal and balanced sentence elements. So if you ever wonder why you use a semicolon, you're actually saying you're actually dividing things that are equal or balanced. And the examples here are independent clauses without a coordinating conjunction. Complicated compound sentences. A complicated just means a sentence, a compound sentence that already contains commas. We just covered this, in the previous slide of what happens when you have things that already contain commas. How do you separate them further? Well, it's the semicolon. Or items in a series that already contain commas, which I previously mentioned. So it's a balanced, a separator. And just the internal comma, maybe just a little bit more comments here, is that in a compound sentence you have we'll discover you have two independent clauses. So it's going to separate those equal independent clauses. And items in a series, even though they contain items, it will be separated between the items of the series. So it's always equal. It's always separating an equal or a like item from a like item. And some people like to say the semicolon can be thought of as a weak period or a strong comma. Now colon mainly separates, not always true, but it mainly separates unequal sentence elements. So it separates an independent clause from an explanation, a list, or an appositive. So an explanation is just usually what happens is you have an independent clause and then you have it followed by an example or more detailed explanation, and you can put a colon there. We'll cover these. Or a list. Maybe you have a clause followed by a list. And a appositive is just something that renames something. So I will cover what an appositive is, but it's basically separating unequal, meaning and maybe the next element actually says this. Oh yes, a colon is always preceded by an independent clause. So what happens is you always have an independent clause, and then you have something that follows. And usually it's unequal, because what follows is generally not an independent clause. It could just be a list or an appositive. So that's the main thing. If you don't know, the main thing you need to take away from a colon, which I will probably repeat 10 more times through my videos, is you always have an independent clause and then a colon. Or a colon is always preceded by an independent clause. A hyphen. A hyphen has a variety of uses. It separates words in a compound word, like well-known. It separates some prefixes and suffixes, like ex-husband and pre-1990. And it separates letters and spelled out words, like Smith. The dash. The dash is always, or you'll hear called an M dash. An M dash is just really referring to the length of the dash is the length of a capital M. It's usually written with 2 hyphens. If you're on a computer, you type in 2 hyphens. Generally, it may automatically make this long dash. But court reporting, where you don't actually have a computer or you're using a different font that doesn't have the long dash or the M dash, you just use 2 hyphens. And the spacing before or after the dash depends on the style. So like in the court reporting style, there's always if you have a word, so here's a dash here, you'd always have the word, a space, and then the dash, a space, and then a word. But that spacing really depends on the style that you're using. And the dash, why do you use a dash? Well, it indicates a shift or an interruption, usually a sudden shift. It's a sudden shift or interruption. So a shift could be someone is talking mid-sentence and suddenly just changes their thought mid-sentence and doesn't end the sentence, just switches. You can use a dash. Or an interruption. You could have someone doing question answer and someone interrupts somebody. Well, you would use a dash. It also indicates emphasis. So in summary, the dash can be used to, one, separate a non-essential element that has internal punctuation, which I covered earlier, or it can be used to emphasize a non-essential element. And I don't recommend this for court reporting. This is more of me speaking now. To me, I equate this to like the use of the exclamation point. We don't use the exclamation point because it emphasizes the word, and that's basically you're starting to the court reporter or proofreader is starting to interpret, and that isn't the point of court reporting. So if you're going to be using a dash for emphasis, in my opinion, you're sort of using it like you're using a exclamation point. And 3, it can be used to replace a colon to emphasize what follows. Once again, it can be used this way. I don't recommend using it because you're starting to emphasize, but that is how it is used. And what I said was mainly my opinion for court reporting. So the quotation mark, double quotation marks shows a direct quote. You're actually quoting somebody, or shows what someone is saying, directly saying. Quotation marks are also used for titles of larger portions of work, like a book titles of portions of a larger work, like a book chapter or magazine article, or to show special emphasis, or with a long compound adjective, like I gave him the don't you even think about it look. Because technically this could be, this is a compound adjective, and it could actually have dashes, but or dashes in between all those words, but once you get to a certain amount of words, they say use double quotes. And going back to this thing right here about using quotes with titles of portions of larger works like book chapters and magazine articles, that's because books and magazines actually use italics. So the book would actually be in italics, and if you were actually referencing a chapter in a book, you would put that in quotes. And if you're referring to a magazine, you'd actually put the magazine in italics, and an article in the magazine would appear in quotes. And sequential quotes show a quote within a quote. Parentheses. Parentheses in general writing indicate incidental or parenthetical information, and it basically de-emphasizes the information. So once again, before I said like a comma is a general separator neutral, the dash emphasizes and the parentheses de-emphasize it. So you could think about that information. You could put it in. You could separate it with commas, dashes, or parentheses. And parentheses actually de-emphasize the information. That's actually the purpose in general writing. It's almost parenthetical. You're putting in there like, oh, this is just additional information that you may find interesting. In court reporting, however, we really don't use parentheses how they're normally used in general writing. Parentheses in court reporting are used for explanatory information like exhibits or recess or witness gestures. They're used very specifically and only for certain things. So that's it for this video. Please subscribe. If you like the video, please hit like, and please buy the ebook.